And welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings. Joining me today, he's back on the show, is Joe Lanza. Joe comes to us from the Flagship Wrestling Podcast. Joe, you're back by popular demand. The listeners, the viewers, they demanded more Lanza, which I know is not unusual for your experience on podcasting, but we're very happy to have you back on the show.
Yeah, it's not a surprise. Whenever I guest on a podcast, I generally pop a number. So whether it's the listeners demanding me back or the host knowing where the bread is buttered, I'm usually asked back. Hey, I have a question for you. I meant to ask you this last time.
Sure.
Why is it the Gentleman's Podcast? Are you trying to imply that other wrestling podcasts are not hosted by gentlemen? Podcasts, perhaps specifically like the Flagship podcast on the Voice of Wrestling Podcast Network?
You know, Joe, I have the utmost respect for the genteel folk of Joe Lanza and Rich Kraetsch. And I guess I've never really explained the origins of the name. So when Jason Umperser, who is my former co-host of the show, um, when he and I were kind of pitching ideas and names for the pod, I came up with this one because the original concept behind the pod, and it's basically it still is the original concept. It's just a little bit different. But the original idea was to approach instead of just doing, we weren't going to do a review pod where we review shows because that's boring. And we weren't going to do like an immediate reaction pod. And we weren't going to do like what's happening this week in wrestling. Let's go over the news pod. What I wanted to do was kind of take one topic and explore it across 90 minutes or whatever. I don't know how long each episode is going to be, and I thought of it as almost like you read like these really long New Yorker articles about certain topics, and they'll be extremely long and extremely detailed, and I wanted to kind of at least give off that approach to pro wrestling analysis, in the sense that I'm not here to give out hot takes. I'm not here to like just say inflammatory stuff. I'm not out here to only to give you thoughts that I barely thought out. This is something that I think I take really seriously. I know you take this really seriously. And yeah, we want to be entertaining. Yeah, we want to be give the people, something cool to listen to, but at the same time, I want to approach these things with a lot of respect and a lot of research. And so I wanted to kind of give off the approach that this is like a classier version of a podcast, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't expecting such a thorough and real answer. I was just expecting you to call me a heathen and to move on. I was expecting you to agree that you are the only gentleman in podcasting and give me a burial. And but listen, now you've given your listeners the background as to how the title of this podcast came to be. So I got something good out of you there. See, I'm already paying dividends.
Yeah. So today I wanted to have you on, and this is something that we've talked about a lot off air in the past, and something we've communicated on. And we want to review Triple H's first few months in charge of WWE. We wanted to look at what he's done so far, kind of how audiences have reacted to what he's done so far, how that compares to what WWE has done previously, and what can we expect from him and his leadership of WWE in the future. And it's funny, I came up with this idea of like, let's review Triple H's first 100 days, which is, how a lot of political and analysts look at presidencies and governorships and things like that. What did you do during your first 100 days? It's always seen as this important cornerstone of politics. And I was thinking, well, all I could really remember was that Triple H had taken over WWE officially, kind of had officially gotten the reins like right before SummerSlam. Like it was that week before SummerSlam. You remember that?
Yes.
And so in my mind, I was saying, all right, well, SummerSlam is in late August, which means that Triple H took over in late August. So, we're now here almost at the very end of November. And, okay, we had all of September, all of October, now all of November. We got to be right around 100 days. And then after a while, I looked up to get the actual date, and then it was July 25th. And I said, July 25th? No, it was right before SummerSlam. Joe, I completely forgot that SummerSlam this year was like early August or late July. Like it was like 3 or 4 weeks earlier than it normally was. And I had just completely forgotten about that in my brain. Just
SummerSlam was July 30th.
yes. So, and because I know that's part of the Clash at the Castle kind of was around the normal, more typical SummerSlam's time. Uh, and so I had completely retconned. Triple H has actually been in charge for a little bit longer than 100 days. It's actually about an extra month longer, which is why, and I'm going to try this gimmick here, and I hope it works, and I hope it's not a complete disaster. But I made a hastily made PowerPoint presentation that I want to show everyone, and I'm going to add it to the listeners. And the viewers, really, the listeners will actually not see any of this because they're listeners, but the viewers, they're going to be seeing this PowerPoint.
Yeah, Drew. This is Drew Gulak gimmick stealing is what's happening here.
Yeah, it really is. I'm really taking a page out of Brandon Thurston and WrestleNomics. I mean, his PowerPoints look way better than mine. I may have put this together in 10 minutes before we started recording, but this is Triple H's first 127 days.
Not quite as catchy as 100 days, but people get the idea.
Yes, we're looking at about a third of the year in total, a little bit under of a third of the year. And I think enough time for us to really kind of evaluate Triple H's run in WWE. Because do you remember, Joe, like 2 weeks after he took control, everyone kind of, including myself, everyone kind of exhausted themselves micro analyzing everything that the show did. And in hindsight, the shows were not very different at all. But everyone exhausted themselves talking about, oh, this is different. This is different. Look at it. What is the changes that Triple H has brought in? And obviously that looks foolish in hindsight because we're now well removed from his original takeover, and there's still a lot I think to be explored with his reign in charge. But I think definitely the first few weeks were overanalyzed, considering that it was really infeasible for him to make a lot of changes in those first few weeks.
There was reasonable excitement, right? Because Vince McMahon's vision of pro wrestling obviously had run off a lot of people. And I think even the hardcore WWE fan, if they were being honest with themselves, knew that there was a lot of flaws with Vince McMahon's version of this product, particularly in the last few years where he was really worse than ever in terms of his creative. So, and obviously had been in control for nearly 4 decades. So obviously there was going to be a period of time where people were going to microanalyze. I just think that was natural. And, there was some curiosity so I think that is what led to a lot of the sort of exaggeration of the changes that were taking place. There certainly were some small changes, and there have been some small changes that have sustained, but yeah, people, because they were excited, I think, were overdoing it, and it's understandable though. It was a huge change. It's the biggest news story in the history of modern wrestling. Vince McMahon's forced ouster. You can call it a resignation if you want. You can call it a retirement. Let's face it, this guy was forced out. And I think it was reasonable that for a couple of weeks there, people were really microanalyzing, as you put it, some of the small changes that Triple H made initially.
Right. And I think I want to blow through these ones pretty quickly, but just to kind of look at what I think we can expect. And just I wanted to go through real quickly, just these are from WrestleNomics. These are just real quick business breakdowns of kind of Triple H's time. If you look at the center column, we can see WWE SmackDown and WWE Raw attendances by month, dating back to last July. And if you look right around, July, August, September, October, that's the months we're looking at Triple H taking over. And you can see that in April, May, and June, you can see kind of a decline in attendance for both Raw and SmackDown. Both of them go from about, in the ballpark of 8,000, per show, and that's in March and April, kind of the big WrestleMania seasons, to kind of the predictable seasonal decline that we have seen in WWE for years and years, which is WrestleMania peaks and then attendance dwindles down. In June, SmackDown averaged 6,039 people, Raw averaged 5,954. July hits. Vince McMahon, this is important when it comes to business analysis. The Vince McMahon scandal hits a few weeks before Triple H fully takes over. And that scandal did lead to an increase in attendance and in viewership. And we saw that like the first SmackDown where Vince appeared on SmackDown during the same day the Wall Street Journal article came out. That SmackDown did a huge number. So there was kind of this artificial bump that occurred right before Triple H took over. But really, you can see in July, August, and September, WWE's business picks up from an attendance standpoint. We can go to television ratings right here. If you look on the left and right, the two left-hand columns on SmackDown and Raw, you can see increases in both total viewers and 18 to 49. Particularly for Raw, you can see that Raw is up 5% year over year in October for 2022 compared to 2021, which is pretty dramatic when you consider that Raw has basically been in decline for the last, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years. SmackDown sees less improvement, but I think it's safe to say, Joe, that there was at least a somewhat of a positive bump originally for when Triple H took over for both SmackDown and Raw.
Yeah, there was absolutely a curiosity bump, and I talked about that a lot on my shows, where it was very clear a lot of lapsed viewers or lost viewers came back to sample what this guy's vision was going to look like. And I warned at the time that there simply weren't enough changes, significant changes, real changes. Not announcers saying the word wrestler once an hour, not slightly longer matches. I mean, real significant changes to the look, feel, and tone of the show. And I warned that there wasn't enough of that to keep those people around. And I based that partly on myself because I was one of those curiosity viewers who came back and made it appointment viewing live, not on my DVR. I want to see what's happening on Raw and SmackDown. I want to see if this guy's making significant changes. And after 2-3 weeks, if it wasn't my job, I would have hand waved it at that point because the shows looked, felt, and exactly the same as they did under McMahon in terms of big picture. But I stuck with it a little longer because it's what I do. And then eventually 6-7 weeks in, I eventually had enough and I hand waved it like a lot of other people did. And if you look at some of the television numbers now, if you compare year over year, ever since that initial curiosity, if you look at October, SmackDown was flat in total viewership year over year. Raw was essentially flat. I think they were up barely 1%. And in the 18 to 49, SmackDown was down 8% in October. Raw was flat. So now you see what I warned about. The television didn't show significant changes. They didn't hold on to any of those curiosity viewers who came back. And, essentially they're doing roughly the same numbers they were doing under McMahon a year earlier, if you look at the year over years, which I think is an indictment of the early portion, the first 100+ days of this regime, because he really had a chance to show people that this thing was going to be drastically different. And, I don't want to use the phrase he dropped the ball because maybe he didn't want to make drastic changes. Maybe that was never his intent. And I guess we get into that later, but the fact is they didn't. And a lot of people see it as the same old Raw and the same old SmackDown. And now, for the most part, they're doing the same old viewership. Oddly enough, the only show that's still showing significant growth is NXT. And that's the one where he's mostly hands off. Shawn Michaels is said to have more power than ever in terms of being in control of that show.
Yeah.
So
I want to point out that the data that I have on the slide right here doesn't have November's data left, but we're led to believe what we've gathered so far in November is that Raw is basically back down to what it was doing under Vince McMahon during Monday Night Football. It's getting close to all-time lows. It's that kind of thing. SmackDown's fluctuated a little bit more. I think there are a few reasons for that. So it's harder to get a read on Smack.
I've got November in front of me if you want it
Sure, yeah.
quickly. Yeah, November year over year in total viewership. Raw currently, I think November's in the books for Raw, right? There's no more Mondays in
Right.
the.
Yeah, yeah. And, and
Uh,
and actually for SmackDown too, because next SmackDown will be on December 2nd.
that's right. It's a 30-day month, so we're in the books here for all of these shows. Raw is down 2%, so let's just call it flat. SmackDown was up 5% year over year, and in the 18 to 49, both shows were a little down. Raw was down 6% from last year, and SmackDown was down 3%. So that speaks to my point. You know, we're now 3-4 months in, and that curiosity bump that they earned is gone. It's completely gone. And these shows are, in fact, doing less viewers now than they were the year before under Vince. And I'm not sure a lot of the people listening to this podcast right now who aren't tuned into these numbers on a day in, day out basis the way we are, you on WrestleNomics, you doing this podcast, me doing what I do. I'm not sure a lot of people would have thought that that was the case, you know, because I think the perception is that the company's red hot and Triple H has turned things around. And in some respects, you could say that he has. The stock's up. I don't know how much you want to put that, on Triple H's plate. I mean, I would argue that that has very little to do with moves that he's made to this point, the stock being up. But perhaps that's a better topic for WrestleNomics. But the television ratings are right back where we started. And last year, it's not like people were throwing roses at Vince McMahon for the television numbers that these shows were putting up. And Triple H is now coming in slightly below those figures
Yeah.
after being granted that curiosity bump,
Yeah. I
which
mean,
was such a huge advantage, and it was squandered.
the people who are kind of blindly praising, no, I don't even say blindly. The people who are really into like Triple H save WWE, what Triple H is doing is awesome now. I don't know how much of a Venn diagram there is between those fans and the fans who are looking at, the 18 to 49 year over years. I did want to just show here is this is from WrestleTix. This is the breakdown of Survivor Series. Survivor Series, from a business standpoint, was a really successful event. It basically sold out the TD Garden, which I think for the first time has been the first time they've sold out that building. I'm gonna go ahead and guess it since the Royal Rumble 2011. I want to say would have been that Royal Rumble. That was the 40-man Rumble that Alberto Del Rio won. I feel like that's probably the last time they sold out the TD Garden. And Triple H said it was the biggest gate that they've ever had in that building, which I believe, since ticket prices have gone up a lot since 2011. But that was a hugely successful show, and it sold out basically months before, which was it was big part of that initial wave of attendance. But I did just want to point that out. But I think you're right in the sense that the business side of things has really cooled off after original optimism. And I don't know if the expectation should have been that all those curiosity viewers, those people that were tuning into Raw and SmackDown to see it be different, if it would really, if you could have really assumed that you would keep all of those viewers, but you would expect to keep some of them if the product was radically different. And one of the things I think is going to be a continued theme of what we're going to discuss here is that it just simply isn't. And we can explore some of the reasons for that. But I wanted to talk about Triple H's strengths and weaknesses. And I think this is a good way to kind of evaluate a lot of different things that have happened so far. So Joe, we're going to go to a slide. It's going to be a strength, and we're going to discuss kind of what that means and what kind of impact that has on WWE. And so his first strength is a very simple one, and it's that Triple H likes wrestling. Now, what does that mean? That means that Triple H actually enjoys professional wrestling, which sounds like it shouldn't really be a strength. But when comparing him to Vince McMahon, it actually means quite a bit, because unlike Vince McMahon, Triple H is not afraid to say the word wrestling. He's not afraid to be labeled as wrestling. He's done things like trying to pay homage to the history more than Vince McMahon did. We saw that one of the earliest things he did was, air these video packages for the United States Championship and the Intercontinental title and kind of remind fans that these things are important and that this is our history and that history should be valued. Many people will note that Michael Cole and other WWE announcers have been enabled to talk about wrestling more than maybe they were under Vince McMahon. Things like Pro Wrestling Guerrilla could be mentioned on air. They could mention the Bullet Club. They could mention New Japan Pro Wrestling. There are small differences you can tell just from the product that the person who is running the company actually does like pro wrestling as opposed to absolutely detest it, which is what Vince McMahon often felt like.
Yeah, this would fall under the category of those small changes that we talked about earlier. And there have been small changes that, during the exciting period where Vince was first gone, they were being extrapolated into major changes, but they're really not.
Well, I think from if we're viewing the product right now, there are not major changes. But I think just as a fundamental philosophical approach to the product that they're presenting, it's a pretty big difference to me that Triple H is someone that like respects the idea of pro wrestling as opposed to Vince McMahon, was always very, hesitant to be labeled like that.
For sure. But I would also keep that at arm's length. And I'll give you a good analogy. When AEW rolled out Rampage, what did Tony Khan say?
It's not a B show.
That's right. 2 A shows. Every press, every media call, every what he calls a post-show scrum, but they're not really scrums. The press conferences after the pay-per-views, stressing it's not a B show. We have 2 A shows, and it started off as an A show. I think everybody would agree with that. It really was the home of CM Punk. I mean, Punk didn't wrestle on Dynamite for a number of weeks. He was on Rampage every week. He debuted on Rampage and he was on Rampage for a number of weeks before he ever appeared on Dynamite. It truly was an A show. But eventually, like almost always happens in Major League American Wrestling, these promoters lose interest in these new shows and they inevitably drift down and become B shows. And I think everyone would agree that Rampage is now a B show. Circling back to this, the emphasis on the history of the Intercontinental title and the history of the US title and these video packages that were run in the early days of Triple H's regime. I see genuine effort being put into rebuilding those titles, which is something that Vince McMahon didn't value at all. And he destroyed any value that any of his titles had, with the exception of his 2 world titles, which at one time, the value of those were destroyed, but they did a good job rehabbing those. Triple H is trying to rehab all of the belts. And I do see that effort early on, but will he lose interest in that? So I'm keeping this at arm's length because that's the kind of thing I could easily see him losing interest in. When he's wrapped up in a million other things, and it could be a situation where, he just sees them as secondary titles and they kind of drift aimlessly the way they did prior. So, look, Gunther's doing a great job with the Intercontinental title. I've loved his matches. I've enjoyed his title reign. But is that just because there's an exceptional wrestler holding that title? I haven't enjoyed the US title stuff nearly as much. Why? Because we have stuff like Austin Theory winning it on a fluke in a 3-way match. And it's the same old shit that we were getting before. So I'm keeping this at arm's length. I agree with you that this could be a major positive and is on paper a strength of his. But let's see if long-term these sorts of things hold his interest.
Mm-hmm. Somewhat similar is his strength, which is he understands work rate. And what I mean by that is that Vince McMahon, in his infinite wisdom, did not understand that wrestling fans might want to just watch someone who's good at wrestling go out and wrestle. That never excited Vince McMahon, and therefore it was rarely reflected in his product. Something that I've noticed so far, and again, these are minor changes in the grand scheme of things, but something I've noticed is that Triple H at least recognizes when someone on his roster is a good worker and will put them in a position to go out and have good, entertaining matches. That doesn't necessarily mean that that person is going to be pushed to the moon. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win matches. But we have seen a kind of, and it kind of goes in hand with some of the mid card revival stuff that we have seen at least Triple H in WWE under Triple H kind of just let guys like Gunther, like Walter, like Sheamus, wrestlers like Chad Gable, or even Ali, at least let them go out and wrestle and not necessarily have to give them a crazy gimmick or create this sports entertainment aspect of them that would be there to entertain Vince. They're at least allowed to be presented that way. And I think that's a step in the right direction.
I agree. I agree with you that this is one of his strengths. He has let performers go out there and do what they do best. And specifically, as you talked about, he's let wrestlers wrestle their way. Gunther and Sheamus going out there and having the kinds of this, if Gunther and Sheamus they would have had these same matches they had in WWE if they took place in New Japan or AEW or on a Rev Pro show or some indie show somewhere. They're the same matches. He let them go out there and do what they do and do what they do best. And obviously Vince McMahon, for the most part, would try to fit everybody into his box of what he thought, pro wrestling should be. So I completely agree with you. We've seen people like Ricochet come back to TV. You mentioned Ali, and undoubtedly, I mean, this is a fact. The match lengths have increased. So that again tells you that he's letting people go out there and perform. Are they all knocking it out of the park? No. We've seen some people drop the ball. Damage Control, I would say, has been a bust, to give you one example, both from a bell-to-bell standpoint and every time they're put in a position to draw in a key spot on Raw, they bomb in the ratings. But he's letting people go out there and perform to their strengths. And I completely agree with you that this would be one of his strengths, as your slide here says, understands work rate.
It's another one, and I think this one is also important. Again, these are all kind of connected to the same idea. This is recognizing momentum, and I posted a photo of Sami Zayn wearing his honorary Uso shirt. Now, I don't want to get too far into an analysis of the Bloodline and Sami Zayn program. I know you're gonna want to talk about that this week on the Flagship. It's been talked about before on this program, but I wanted to use this just as an example of something that I find to be different than Vince McMahon, in the sense that I feel like I'm of the belief that they've stumbled into this Sami Zayn Bloodline thing. I don't think that they anticipated it to be as big as it has become, but they have wisely chosen to roll with it and to present it as a prominent aspect of their show, because it is something that is getting over with the live audience. And I think that's different than Vince McMahon, who had this gigantic ego, who had to be convinced that everything was his idea, otherwise he didn't believe in it. And I think at least Triple H is wise enough at this stage of the game to recognize when something is hot and to go with it. And that has been a huge criticism of WWE in the past, that the company was never flexible, and anytime someone was able to gain some organic momentum for any reason, they were cut off at the legs, oftentimes in embarrassing, humiliating fashion. We can go down the list of people who were like that, but people like Zack Ryder, people like Bryan Danielson, people like CM Punk, all these guys that kind of got over against the grain were eventually cut off. At least so far, again, only 127 days in, we have seen that Triple H is at least open to running with something if it starts to get over.
Yeah, there's a good chance that Vince would have cut this Sami Zayn thing off at the legs.
Or he would have made Sami Zayn do some even dumber stuff than he's done to entertain him, because he wouldn't understand it.
Yeah, he would have had him turn it up to 12, and he would have found one small facet of this super entertaining and just used the subtlety hammer to hammer it home. And there's a good chance it wouldn't just be allowed to organically grow, like you noted earlier. And I do agree that that is also a good sign, where if something does catch on. You gave a bunch of examples. Braun Strowman at one point was getting hot, but it was right in the middle of one of Roman Reigns' big failed babyface attempts, and they didn't want to derail the Roman train, so they kind of cut Strowman off at the knees, and he never recovered. I mean, the fans never believed in Braun Strowman again when they cut him off. So this is really the first example of something catching on that they may not have even intended. And Triple H is one for one because they've obviously run with it.
In the way WWE's business is structured, they don't need to come up with the next great angle. They don't need to have the NWO happen, or they don't need, Steve Austin to walk through the door. I WWE would be in a much better position now if they hadn't just engaged in all this self-sabotage that they have over the final years of Vince McMahon. And so if someone is in the seat now who at least will recognize when the crowd chooses somebody and will be open-minded enough to push that person, that's a huge difference in something that will have a massive impact on the company.
Yeah, for sure.
Our next one, this is a small one, but maybe not, is that he's not a known criminal, which Vince McMahon was. To my knowledge, Triple H has never been accused of or been convicted of a crime. Vince McMahon obviously was on multiple occasions, or at least was speculated to. So that's a small thing, but that's an improvement, I think, over Vince. Again, this
Hey,
is very low.
Is someone ever gonna ask this guy what he knew? I mean, this wasn't just his boss for 25 years, it was also his father-in-law. I mean, is someone at least going to ask Paul Levesque what he knew, how much he knew, and when he knew it?
Well, Joe, it's funny you mentioned that because his next strength is media transparency. And again, this is in relation to Vince McMahon because Triple H did give a press. He was at a press conference on Saturday night right after Survivor Series. He stood up on a podium and he fielded questions from the wrestling media. I mean, the people who ask questions by and large were, for the most part, people who also attend the Tony Khan pressers and are recognized wrestling media figures. None of them had any questions about Vince McMahon. None of them had any questions about, how much did Triple H know? None of them had any real questions about his leadership in general. They basically just asked, will we see War Games again, about 7 different times, and then he stopped. But I'll give him credit in the sense that he is much more media friendly and transparent than Vince McMahon was, which again is a low bar. Vince McMahon, I think, gave one interview over 20 years, but at least is an improvement, and I think something that has benefited him and has benefited WWE's brand since he took over. This idea that he's more accessible than Vince was.
How much of this do you think? This is the second presser he's held after a pay-per-view. He did one after
Clash at the Castle.
Yeah, the one that I always misname, so I let you do it. What's it called? What was it? Clash at the Castle?
Clash at the Castle.
I don't know why I can't keep that straight. So he's done 2 of these, and he's obviously done the phoners when he was with NXT. And I think they now have Shawn Michaels doing those phoners, if I'm not mistaken. But how much of this do you think is a direct result of Tony Khan doing them? And essentially, I mean, I think it's fair to say that those have turned out to be train wrecks, considering what happened after All Out. And do you think this is Paul's way of saying, look how professional and slick and well-spoken and corporate I am compared to the guy who comes on after his pay-per-views, speaks erratically, never blinks, has wrestlers going into business for themselves and shooting on each other. And in general, it's an hour and a half plus of chaos. But look at me up here in my tailored suit, and I'm well spoken, and I say all the right things, and I'm super corporate. And how much of this is him doing this to sort of highlight the dichotomy between his publicly traded billion-dollar conglomerate and Tony's little side project, and how the dichotomy between the press conferences sort of exemplifies that idea. Do you think he'd be doing these if Tony Khan didn't do them? I guess would be the short version of that question.
Was he doing the NXT media calls before AEW kind of popped up?
I want to say yes. I want to say they were doing those phoners before AEW existed. Like, remember the fruit basket that Reddit sent him and all of that. I feel like that was all before AEW, but I'm willing to be corrected if that's not true.
So if that is the case, it's hard to say that he's doing all of this specifically in relationship to AEW. I do think that the post pay-per-view press conferences where you invite the wrestling media, like the actual wrestling media, um, to ask questions in front of a podium, and you have talent come out and talk about things like, breaking kayfabe, kind of. Uh, I think that is directly lifted from AEW's approach. I don't know how much of it is Triple H being motivated by look how much better and slicker we are than these unorganized, AEW press scrums. And how much of it is Triple H and WWE acknowledging that in relation to AEW that they might have an image problem. They might not, they don't feel as accessible, they don't feel as media friendly. And this is Triple H trying to show that they can be just as media friendly, just as accessible, just as down with the hardcore fans as AEW is, because they recognize that AEW has taken that segment of their fan base just from a branding and identity standpoint as the company for the hardcore fan. And these press conferences service the hardcore fan. Um, Without getting into too much criticism of the press conference, I thought the Triple H press conference I thought was a joke. I mean, I'm really disappointed in the questions that were asked. I'm really disappointed in how nobody asked this guy anything remotely interesting about Vince McMahon, which is the number one thing you would want to ask. It's such a golden opportunity to ask, um, Triple H face to face with, thousands of people watching and having it being streamed live. So there's real no way for him to wriggle out of it. Uh, None of them asked him any interesting questions. So it'll be interesting to see over time. And this is the case with AEW, right? The first AEW press conferences, there wasn't necessarily full of great questions, but over time you've seen the questions get better and better, and as the people get more comfortable in that setting. If this continues to be a thing where Triple H is going and having these press conferences with the same media people after, even if it's just after the major pay-per-views, will you see people become more and more comfortable and getting, more and more comfortable asking him difficult questions the way they've become in the AEW press conferences with Tony Khan?
Listen, a tip for anybody listening to this who may end up in the room when Triple H is doing one of these. I'm sorry. Your first question has to be your boss of 25 years, who also happens to be your father-in-law, resigned in shame due to a sex scandal. How much did you know? When did you know it? And what changes has your company made to ensure that those sorts of behaviors do not happen again? How is that not the first question that anybody in that room asks? That has to be question number one. And I want to see how he handles a question like that. I think he'll handle that question well, because I think he's thought about the answer, because he knows he's going to get asked at some point. Maybe it isn't going to be by Ariel Helwani or Ryan Satin or any of these soft landing interviews that Nick Khan sets up for him, these long form interviews where they're busy thanking him for the great product that he's providing rather than trying to ask him anything interesting. Maybe it won't be from those people. But if you have an opportunity to be in the room with him, I think he probably realizes at some point he's going to get those questions. And I think he has the answer prepared. But that's not the point. The point is somebody has to ask it. And you have to get him on record with an answer. I mean, that's so important. And we're now 0 for 2 collectively as a media in taking a hack here at this guy and having an opportunity. I mean, the people in the UK were a flat out embarrassment. They were even worse than this last one. I mean, they were just clapping, applauding him when he came on the stage and applauding the wrestlers and playing along with the kayfabe. That was an absolute disgrace. Okay, the second one wasn't quite as bad. And to be honest, I think the Tony Khan ones are getting better, and I think people are a little too hard on those because, yes, there's some bad questions. You're always going to have your Wrestle Joys or people like that who just are going to ask awful questions. For the most part, though, I think the quality of the questions have improved both on the media calls and the press scrums following the pay-per-views. And you got to give a break. Look, I don't like when the local outlets ask when is AEW going to come to Dallas, but if you work for a radio station in Dallas, that's your job. The people that you work for, your customers, your listeners, if you're a radio, whatever the case may be, those are the things they want to know. similar that if you're in the room or I'm in the room, we're going to ask the questions that our customers want us to ask. So I think people are a little too hard sometimes on some of those questions. And you're always going to get some bad ones. You go to any real sports press conference, they're loaded with awful questions. So the wrestling media isn't any different. You're going to get awful questions from the wrestling media as well.
Yeah,
But
and with Tony, like if you watched his last few pressers, what has been the first question that Tony has been asked every single time?
I mean, and they know he's not going to answer it.
But
But
they've
he's
asked. They've
yes,
asked.
yeah,
That's
that's
the
right.
first question that's been asked. So for all the criticism that's been levied at the media for these AEW press conferences, and definitely made criticisms. I've attended some of these scrums before and asked questions in them, but he's being asked the tough questions. Triple H is not. And so it's hard for me to really assess Triple H's, transparency when he's being asked if, do you think you'll do war games next year in 7 different ways? And then he's leaving.
Right. I think they're intimidated a bit by him. And
Oh, I think there's a ton of things. They're intimidated by him. Some people really just don't see that as an important topic to ask. Some people don't want to lose access to WWE. The world we live in where clicks are everything, and getting content that gets traction on social media is considered very important. Having connections with WWE and the possibility of interviewing WWE talent and things like that are all really, really important to these different outlets, and they're going to cater towards WWE because they're that massive whale in the industry of pro wrestling.
yeah.
So the key is with these strengths here is that all of these strengths that I think we've talked about, that he likes pro wrestling, that he's not a criminal, that he's media transparent, all things you would think would be standard fare for any wrestling promoter. Every wrestling promoter should like wrestling. Every wrestling promoter should understand work rate. Every wrestling promoter should not get in the way if something catches on with momentum and understands the will of the fans. But these seem like strengths for Triple H because they're all relative to him taking over from Vince, who was none of these things. And Vince had all these kind of catastrophic weaknesses that any competent person doesn't have, which is as Triple H steps in, he immediately appears to be significantly better for those reasons. I think the real question we should be asking ourselves is how does he compare to his peers? How do those strengths that Triple H allegedly have, how does that compare to the strengths of other people in his position? And I've selected Tony Khan and Gato as the two of his real peers, right? Would you say that that's correct, that those are his peers when it comes to running a wrestling company at this kind of scale?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, those would be the two best examples. Yeah.
And so does Triple H like pro wrestling any more than we feel like Gato or Tony Khan does? Does Triple H understand work rate more than Gato or Tony Khan? Does Triple H not quash momentum any more than Gato or Tony Khan? Is Triple H more media transparent than Gato and Tony Khan? Maybe. But I think if you were to compare him, if you compare him to Vince with all these strengths, he appears to be much more suitable for the role. But when you compare him to other people who aren't Vince, I think he doesn't really stand out as a particularly strong candidate or someone who's got a particularly genius aptitude for this.
Yeah, you'll run into situations where he doesn't compare favorably to some of these people, and he compares favorably in other areas. But it's interesting what you did there, where we're measuring him against Vince, and essentially those were all of Vince's biggest weaknesses. So he's scoring very well versus his predecessor in some of these areas. But you're right, he doesn't score as well when you compare him to others in the industry. The big difference, though, of course, is the enormous 40-year head start, and he's starting on a much higher plane than any of these other people. Dwarfing all of these companies in size. You combine AEW and New Japan, and they still, are fraction of the of the revenue that WWE draws. So he has the benefit of starting on a much higher plane. But you're right. The comparisons get a little bit trickier when you compare him to people like this. and who he in theory will be competing with. But again, it's not even truly competition at the level that these other promotions are in relation to WWE.
Yeah, I'm not thinking it strictly from a competitive standpoint. I'm more just thinking about if we're going to assess how good of a booker and how good of a management of talent is Triple H. We can do it makes somewhat more sense to compare him to just someone that isn't Vince because
Yeah.
by most assessments, Vince was so, batshit insane by the time he was finishing up in WWE. It's not Triple H coming in and merely being better than Vince isn't really telling us a whole lot. I mean, look at some of the strengths we just mentioned. Triple H likes wrestling. That's a big difference from Vince McMahon. Like that's insane when you think about it, that someone running a wrestling company didn't like wrestling, but that was Vince. That's who he was. So I think it's helpful to at least keep in mind if we're just really looking at how, if Triple H is going to win Booker of the Year or anything like that, we should be comparing him to other people beyond Vince McMahon, who was just, the senior that the keys needed to be taken away from.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're talking about winning awards like Booker of the Year, I mean, what's a Booker's job? To make money and create new stars. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. And we talked about the year-over-year television, and there's no growth. And there's been growth in ticket sales for sure, and the major shows are doing great. And we all know they're going to get a television raise in 18 months or whatever it is, and the stock is up, and they're going to break more business records, next quarter and all that. But again, I don't know how much those things have to do with what he's done to this point. The changes he's made, you can see in television ratings and ticket sales, more so than the revenue that the company is drawing off of fixed deals that have nothing to do with anything that he has done.
No, I mean, when anyone ever talks about like WWE drawing money in 2022, and whether it's the booking that drew money or whether it's individual talent that drew money, and they use WWE's like total revenue, it just lets you know that you don't have to listen to this person because they don't have a
Well, yeah,
serious
because
argument.
we'll look at Gato and Tony Khan. They're making booking decisions every day that ultimately have a real effect on their bottom line. Whereas Triple H is making booking decisions that really don't.
Right.
They don't, because it's fixed revenue from decades of being the market leader, and they've earned that. But it has nothing to do with the revenue this company makes. The ticket sales is a drop in the bucket. The real money is the fixed revenue from the media rights deals. We all know that. Whereas Gato and Tony Khan, a much larger percentage. I mean, New Japan is a live gate business. I mean, they live and die with the live gate, and a much bigger percentage of AEW's business is derived, from the public, from people buying pay-per-views and buying tickets to shows, and all those, a much larger percentage than WWE. So their decisions have much bigger weight on the bottom line than Triple H's booking decisions, which really you won't know the effect of. It's more long term at that point, with how much they're established and with these fixed revenue deals, these fixed media rights deals. So it's almost, even though he has the same job as these people, it's almost very hard to compare them from that standpoint.
Right. In that sense that in Triple H, in theory, Triple H has more room for experimentation. Triple H can take a lot more risks with booking and creative decisions because they have the security blanket that money is coming in anyway. Tony Khan can't afford to really gamble with like an unproven draw as a pay-per-view main eventer because he's got to sell pay-per-views. And if he doesn't, it's going to be pretty bad for his bottom line. Same thing with Gato. Gato can't really afford to gamble with putting the IWGP World Championship on someone who's an unproven draw and have it burn him because it's going to really hurt his business. We've actually seen that happen in the last few years. But as opposed to WWE, and whether it's under Triple H, whether it's under Vince, they can give Jinder Mahal the world title for 6 months because they're experimenting with trying to create an Indian star. And if it doesn't work, it just doesn't matter. They're still going to make record revenue every year. No difference whatsoever.
Right. That television deal is coming, and they're absolutely getting a raise.
Oh yeah.
And it doesn't matter what Triple H does. And on a day in, day out basis, on next week's SmackDown, it doesn't make a difference.
They
That
could, their next television deal They don't need their next television deal could be like a third of what it is now, and they'd still be making ridiculous amounts of money, and they wouldn't be shuttering the doors on that company.
Right. And they're getting a raise. We all know this.
Yeah.
So, it's and that's kind of why, and I know we disagree on the point I'm about to make, but that's kind of why I feel he has been conservative and he hasn't made sweeping changes. And I think that's why that Raw and SmackDown are largely the same shows as they were under Vince, because what is the incentive to shake things up and make major changes? Because they know they have that core fan base of roughly 2 million people, right? Something like 2.1 or 2.2 million people watch SmackDown every week. And non-football, okay, when it's not football season, somewhere around 1.8, 1.9. Again, let's just call it, they have about 2 million people who watch their TV every week that aren't going anywhere. We finally found the bottom, and it was about 2 million people, and they're extremely loyal. And if you make sweeping changes and drastically change the presentation of your product, the way the promos are done, the way your video packages are laid out, the pacing of the show, the look of the show, the production, the way you tell your stories, and all of those things that truly would have been major changes, which none of them have changed. Okay. If you go making sweeping changes and do the show and whatever his vision is, and you risk upsetting that core $2 million, 2 million people that make up that core fan base, now you might have some problems, which is why I think they're playing it conservative until they get those new media rights deals. And then maybe we'll see Triple H implement bigger sweeping changes, because then he has 5 years. Right now he has 18 months or whatever it is until the deals are up. I've been saying 18 months for like a year. When are the deals? They're up at the end of 2023, I think. So it's less than 18 months now. It's more like 13 months until, and the negotiations will be before then. So at that point, now you have another 5 years, and then you can play around and dabble with bigger changes. And I'm not confident that he'll do that, but I think that plays into why we haven't seen major. Why? What's the incentive to do so?
Yeah, and we'll get into that later. I kind of have I have we'll mention this in a little bit. I have three kind of theories, and one of them is a theory that you just said about why this product isn't radically different under Triple H than it was under Vince. I wanted to touch on, since we did his strengths, what are his weaknesses? And one of them is no obvious creative differences. I have chosen almost squashing Johnny Gargano as an example of this, because if you watch the show, there are minor things here and there, but realistically, if you look at the creative of WWE, it doesn't look any different under Triple H than it did under Vince McMahon. The Johnny Gargano thing I like the most, because I think now maybe Vince didn't want to hire Johnny Gargano on the main roster, but if he did, this is exactly how Vince would have handled Johnny Gargano. He would have him job into Almost. He'd be him as a sidekick in this Miz feud. It's exactly what Vince would have done with Johnny Gargano. And I think that's a good example of that. Just so far, under Triple H's version of WWE wrestling, there is no obvious creative differences that the viewer can see on Raw and SmackDown.
No, I agree. They're the same shows. And I know a lot of people will disagree with us on this one, but we're talking big picture, and they really are the same shows. And you look at, you're using Johnny Gargano as your example. That Thanos meme that was going around every time he would bring back somebody who the old regime cut, which was very, let me tell you, that was good PR. Here it is. There's your slide. So I guess that transitions to your next topic, but you look at that Thanos meme and all of the names that they brought back, and people can see them on the screen. And, Gargano, he's typical Vince McMahon hamster wheel booking. The Top Dollar and the rest of the what's the name of that unit? The
Hit Row.
So Hit Row, complete non-entities. I mean, and even the WWE core fan base has turned on them because their weaknesses have shown. They weren't ready for the main roster, and they were probably cut for a reason. And they've been complete non-entities on SmackDown, total failures. Damage Control, total bust of an angle, came back with a lot of fanfare. The feud with Bianca is endless and isn't good. And Dakota Kai, who was the member of that group they brought back, is the pin eater for the group. I mean, she's the pin eater. Karrion Kross has made absolutely no impact. Dexter Lumis is an undercard comedy wrestler. Strowman, opened his mouth on Twitter, and now he's doing jobs on TV. The only act that he brought back that seems to have any kind of momentum or is receiving any kind of meaningful push or is making any kind of difference, because all of these other people could have never been brought back, and nothing will have changed meaningfully in the company, is Bray Wyatt. And to be completely honest, he's cooled off dramatically. I mean, you tell me, what's Bray Wyatt been up to? I mean, that has totally cooled off since the QR code thing. I mean, the guy came back and there was tons of interest. He was popping quarter hours, and now he's just kind of there. But I'll give them credit for that one. But everybody else on this glove is a complete non-entity.
Right. I think we don't know exactly what happened, but we can presume, Joe, that Triple H got, he got control of WWE. Vince was gone. And he rubbed his palms together and said, we're going to bring in some talent. And he reached out to some of his loyal former NXT students or his former NXT trainees from the Performance Center who have found their way to All Elite Wrestling and said, hey guys, how about you come work for me? And when none of those people were made available to him, some of them didn't want to come back. Some of them inquired about trying to leave. Some of them maybe even tried to get themselves fired from AEW. But since he couldn't access them, he had to turn to who was available, which for the most part was a class of talent that nobody really wanted that had been released. People like Karrion Kross, people like Hit Row. These are talents that were very, very available because there wasn't interest in them from AEW, and there really wasn't a lot of interest in them from people like New Japan or even Impact. Some of them maybe wrestled some matches in there, but for the most part, they were very, very available. And I think he felt like to start his new regime, he wanted to bring in some new talents, but he got all of these talents that are, like I said in the topic, they're just mid. They're just not top talent. They're not talent that fans are really going to get excited about. The only one I thought that maybe would be able to do it, with the exception of Wyatt, who I think is his own complete unique entity and comes with a certain ceiling and a certain floor. But
sure.
I thought when they brought in Gargano, I said, this is great. He got Gargano back. He's going to be over at first. The fans are going to want to get behind him, and they can push him as a serious wrestler. And I think he'll get over, and he'll be a sign that this is a new era in WWE, and that someone like Johnny Gargano, who Vince had no use for, can come up, feel hot, and be pushed as a legitimate potential top star. And instead, he's been booked as this goofy undercard guy that's trying to get to the bottom of this Miz Loomis feud. And I just thought that was kind of a waste. And now I see the roster is just kind of, it's like this meme. It's getting bloated with all of this talent that isn't, up to top shelf standard. And if you're going to go to war and you're competing for fans with a company like AEW, how many of these guys do you want to have on TV each week? I think it was pretty notable that at Survivor Series, I think with the exception of Gallows and Anderson and the Damage Control girls, none of these people were doing anything on Survivor Series.
Yeah, and to be fair with Damage Control, two of them were already there. The only one they brought back was Dakota Kai.
Right.
So, and you're right. None of these people are getting booked on the pay-per-views, which means they're not involved in significant programs on the television. And look, when he first started bringing these people back, I did think it was great fan service because it did energize their core fan base. And it was another sign that, hey, look, I'm not Vince. All of these popular acts that you allegedly liked, I'm giving them back to you. But at the time, a lot of media people like us were very cynical and saying, yeah, but none of these people are very good. And Vince wasn't necessarily wrong with a lot of these decisions. Vince takes a beating and well-deserved on a lot of fronts, but he's not always wrong. The guy didn't get where he was because he was always wrong. And with people like Karrion Kross, he was right. The guy stinks. With Hit Row, he was right. They whiffed on Swerve, but they got rid of the whole group because, Top Dollar was a pain in the ass in the locker room and three of them weren't ready. And poor BFAB, it isn't her fault. She's green as grass. She didn't belong on the main roster and still doesn't today. Same for Top Dollar. So yeah, a lot of these people, Vince wasn't wrong. And, and we were saying, look, these aren't impact signings. And now time has proven us right because Bray Wyatt's the only one that's meant a thing. And the rest of them are just kind of there. And the rest of them are kind of proving the previous regime correct.
Right.
And I'm surprised about Gargano too. I did think he would push Gargano better. But the Gargano one is a great example though of how the booking in the company fundamentally really hasn't changed. You nailed that then on because he's being used exactly how Vince would have used them. So I think Gargano is the gold standard example of if you think this guy has made meaningful changes, well, here's a great example of how he hasn't. Because here's a dude who he loved when he was booking him in NXT, and he books him the exact same way Vince would have booked him if Vince had him. And Vince never wanted him to begin with. So
yeah, and that to me is an interesting sign if we talk about what are Triple H's real core philosophies to pro wrestling, and was the NXT version of Triple H, was that really what he thought pro wrestling should and could be? Or was it him identifying a market inefficiency that WWE's main roster wasn't utilizing, which was pushing out indie talent and embracing the global world of wrestling? And he did that with NXT, and he brought in indie talent, and he brought in talent from New Japan and from Mexico, and he pushed them. But was that really what he thought of pro wrestling, or does he have a view of pro wrestling that's more similar to Vince, which is how you explain how Johnny Gargano is being pushed on the main roster?
yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to a lot of things we talked about, and then also the idea of again not making these sweeping changes as of yet, and still, maybe maybe it wasn't his intent. Maybe some of these people he thought would have gotten over more on the main roster. Maybe that has something to do with the lack of push for a lot of them. Or maybe it was just all along his idea was, look, this is a great way to freshen up the rosters and also continue to differentiate myself from the previous regime and to whip up some interest in me taking over. Maybe that was his idea all along, and he knew damn well that he wasn't really going to push any of these people. Or maybe some of them in his eyes have just dropped the ball. I mean, has Hit Row impressed you? Has Hit Row impressed any of the listeners?
Hit Row has really impressed me, Joe, actually.
They're a laughing stock on Twitter every time they're on TV.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting, I think, to look at how these people have been used. So Damage Control and Dakota Kai have been presented as, they've been the WWE thing where they're presented as a top act in the sense that they're on TV a lot, but have never been actually booked strong enough to feel like a real threat, and have lost at basically every major point of their...
They lose at every major point. The other thing is they have been put in the main event spot on Raw multiple times, and it always tanks.
Yeah.
It hasn't gotten over, and their storyline with Bianca Belair has not gotten over.
Yeah.
That is an act that he has put effort behind. They've just flopped. That's a flop.
And Karrion Kross, I feel like they really haven't done anything with him.
They really haven't yet. He just doesn't pop off the screen.
Right. And I felt like if they did have big plans for him, it would be like right from when he comes in, and when he debuts, there's at least some artificial momentum for him because he just debuted. How do you capitalize on that? It's not like, okay, we're going to put him basically on ice for a few months and then we'll bring him back and then we'll start booking him.
I think most smart people realized that he was an entrance. They had a really cool entrance for him that got over with people, but there was no substance once the entrance was over. And the other thing people have to remember about Kross is his entire NXT run was during COVID with no fans. So we never really knew if he was over. We knew that the entrance was over on Twitter. We knew that the entrance was over on the internet, but we didn't know if he was really over with fans because he never worked in front of any.
Right. And he was also in NXT, he was also booked like this unbeatable monster, and that just wasn't
always helps.
And that just wasn't going to be the case in the main roster. It also helped that he's like, I don't know, 6'3", and he was wrestling, Adam Cole and Johnny Gargano and Kyle O'Reilly, and Tommaso
Done.
Ciampa, and you can play the monster role if you're wrestling those guys and you're 6'3", 240, but you go on SmackDown and you're on the same roster as Drew McIntyre and Sheamus and Roman Reigns and Walter and all of these legitimately big people. All of a sudden, you can't be the unbeatable monster when you don't really stand out like that.
Yeah.
And Loomis he's on television all the time. He's on Raw about as much as anybody, but I don't think he's in one of those things where he doesn't mean anything. He doesn't mean anything to ratings. They finally blew off the match he finally had with the Miz in the crowd. You could hear a pin drop in the audience for this match that had been built up for months. So like he's just a non-entity, although I would consider that they've actually tried with him. Strowman they brought back. He's a jag. He's just a guy now. Anderson and Gallows, they're I guess doing stuff because they're necessary as side pieces in this feud between the AJ Styles group and the Finn Balor group.
AJ needed pals in the feud,
Yeah,
and it was a natural fit.
yes.
So
And Bray is Bray. I mean, I've said plenty of words on Bray Wyatt. I know you've said plenty of words on Bray Wyatt. I think he's kind of his own unique entity, but it's like they signed all these guys and basically didn't have tons of plans for all of them. And if they didn't have direct plans for them, none of them are going to be good enough to really stand out without like an excellent laid out plan that would to be used to maximize their strengths. You can't put Karrion Kross on the roster without a really strong plan and expect him to swim because he's going to sink pretty quickly.
now, yeah, I mean that's what it comes down to. There's one act on this glove that's made any difference whatsoever, and it's Bray. And I would argue that he's starting to cool off.
Right. And he also is like an established name too. It's not like this is a gem that Vince McMahon let get away. This is someone that had already been on the main roster for years and won world titles and things like that.
Yeah.
Next in line, just real quick, production is the same. This is a picture of Kevin Dunn for people who don't know what Kevin Dunn looks like. This is the man that once told AJ Lee that nobody would ever pay to have sex with her. Is that right? Or maybe
Yeah.
that was Johnny Ace who said that. Anyway,
No.
I remember when Triple H took over, everyone kind of got really excited that the camera cuts were going to go away and that Kevin Dunn would finally be fired and all of this thing would happen. And so far, 100 days into the Triple H reign and the Stephanie McMahon reign, nothing has changed. The production is the exact same as it was when I was on under Vince, and there is no real reports that Kevin Dunn has lost any authority backstage or anything like that. So that I
No,
would
if you're someone in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, or Sioux Falls, whatever state Sioux Falls is in, or and you don't live on the internet and you don't even know that Vince McMahon is out of power, and you're a casual viewer of this company, and you maybe watch Raw once a month, you wouldn't know that a new person is running these shows. There's nothing about these shows that indicates that a new person is in charge to an average casual layman, whatever you want to call it, viewer who isn't uh absorbed in the internet and pro wrestling 24/7 the way we are. What would be the tip off that anyone different is running these shows, from the production to the booking to just the pacing of the show? It's identical. And I
my,
think some of us are too far into the weeds when it comes to wrestling and try to convince ourselves that there's been these changes. But again, in the bigger picture, there have not been, and production is a big one.
yeah. Another one, I think this is really important, is questionable deputies. And I will say, like, we've talked about Shawn Michaels already. Kind of, Shawn Michaels is now running NXT. He handles the NXT media calls. Basically, everything about NXT is credited towards Shawn Michaels in one way or another. I personally don't see NXT as a massive success in really any capacity. Viewership has gone up since Triple H took back control of WWE and therefore took back control of NXT. I don't think NXT the show is radically different since Triple H was in power. I think it's still basically the same as when Triple H had been removed from power. And I think that
It's
comes
it's NXT 2.5. I mean, they got rid of the splash colors and again, very minor changes, but the core of the show and the tone of the show is exactly the same.
It's a bunch of green talent. It's a bunch of wacky gimmicks. It's a bunch of backstage segments that look like the beginnings to pornos. Like
Yes.
it's not any real different. I think that the development coming out of the performance center and the kind of internal talent development that WWE has been poor. I have I really have no evidence to have a lot of confidence in Shawn Michaels as a creative visionary for NXT. Um, or nor do I have any real confidence in the NXT in general as being a place that's going to be able to churn out a lot of top tier talent that the company's going to need going forward. Road Dog Brian James, he's the person in the middle of my screen. He has been brought back. I think what's his actual job? Do you know his actual title?
I don't know. All I know is he was the village idiot on Twitter, constantly making a fool of himself.
He still is. I mean,
Um,
I don't have a ton of confidence in his his vision of pro wrestling, whatever that is. He's very fortunate that Triple H regained control in WWE and has been brought back and given a prominent backstage position because he's just one of those guys that I don't think gets the rest the I don't think he understands wrestling in 2022. Uh and he's not someone that I would want to have in a prominent position backstage. Um and Brian Kendrick, I actually don't know if Brian Kendrick is going to be around long term, but this has been a big story this week. Brian Kendrick was backstage helping out at Survivor Series, and he's obviously made a lot of statements in the past that can be construed as anti-Semitic and has said some conspiracy theory things. And more importantly, well, not more importantly, it's very important that you don't have an anti-Semite backstage. But he was originally what Dave said was that he was brought back because he was Ronda Rousey's trainer, and Rousey requested that he agent her match against Shotzi from Survivor Series. Um, Controversies aside with Brian Kendrick, isn't that like a terrible like first like example to set? Is that the first match you produce, the match you're specifically brought in to produce, is that Shotzi versus Ronda match, which was absolutely horrible.
yeah, I mean that's called a failing a job tryout is what that because that match was objectively horrible, indefensibly bad. But I don't know if there's much you can do to hide Ronda Rousey. I mean, she's just hasn't been good, and she's regressing instead of improving. Um, she no longer has any kind of star aura. She doesn't feel special. Her work is terrible. Shotzi's not someone who's good enough to hide that. But yeah, no, not something he should put on his resume as he attempts to get his way back into wrestling after the controversies that he's been in. But yeah, I
It,
mean,
and this was a big thing for the idea of Triple H taking over from Vince McMahon. That not only was Vince McMahon a plague on WWE, but he also had all these entrenched cronies that would just be yes man for him and were incompetent at their own jobs, and a lot of them are still there. But this idea was that Triple H would come in and he would get rid of all these old, out of date, out of touch guys backstage, and he'd bring in a new school of people. And he had been, working with a whole team at NXT, and he would bring them up when he eventually took over because they were all being groomed for main roster positions. And the reality is that the people that he's brought in so far feel like just old cronies and yes men and this exact same kind of people that Vince McMahon had advising him, and not necessarily people who are with it in the modern sense of pro wrestling. And I think that has been, I would consider that a real disappointment if I was looking at Triple H's takeover as an optimistic moment for WWE, in the sense that you'd be getting different personnel in it. It just seems like more of the same.
yeah, it just speaks to my earlier point. I don't think he's going to make sweeping changes. There's no indication that he's going to do that. He brought back some of his old pals. You don't have Gabe Sapolsky on the slide. He's got Gabe out there traveling the country, hiring extras for the TV.
Yeah, but Gabe I wouldn't consider questionable,
Yeah.
in the sense that I don't know exactly what Gabe's role is, but I think that if Gabe has a role to play in WWE in a way that I think you could get away with not having Road Dogg as
Yeah.
a major
Gabe,
player.
Gabe is scouting indies, which honestly is probably what I'd have him doing too. Um, specifically hiring extras for the television or people for tryouts and things like that. But yeah, no, yeah, we all thought he was grooming his little own circle, which would then replace Bruce Pritchard and Kevin Dunn and all of these people that Vince was keeping around all of these years. But he's kept all of those guys around in the same positions that they were in before. So,
And probably
again,
one of the reasons we haven't noticed a huge difference from the Triple H product and the Vince McMahon product is that a lot of the same executives are the same people in charge as they were under Vince.
Yeah. He's this is why I say he has shown I don't see any evidence that this guy plans on making any kind of big sweeping changes to anything.
Right. And that brings us to our central question, I think, of what we've been discussing all night here is why isn't the product that much different? What is going on here? Why haven't we seen the gigantic seismic shift that many people expected to happen with Triple H taking over from Vince McMahon? And I have three different theories laid out for you, and we've discussed some of them so far, so I won't go into too much detail. The first one here is the cash cow, right? Which is what you've talked about, which is that WWE is already making so much money that Triple H shouldn't change anything that significantly. In fact, it would be foolish to kind of meddle with a product that's already churning out so much money. Why risk it? Why jeopardize, the current product if it's making money, if you're very comfortable with what it's turning out so far? What incentive does Triple H have to change anything? And if he doesn't, then that's an explanation why. And I think that's what you've touched on is kind of being the reason why you don't think there's been a lot of differences in the product.
Right. Yeah, I kind of spoke on this earlier. I kind of jumped ahead, but yeah, I already spoke on this one.
Right. My second theory is in memory of Vince, which is Triple H doesn't want to radically change anything because he respects Vince so much and doesn't want to offend him by drastically altering the product away from Vince's vision. He's kind of alluded to this in some of his interview answers when people have actually asked him about what do you think is going to be different. And he said, there's a lot of respect for Vince McMahon and the vision of Vince McMahon, not just by Triple H, but by Bruce Pritchard and these other people who have been involved, and Stephanie for sure, maybe even Nick Khan. But all these people respect Vince McMahon. And I don't know how much Triple H is communicating with Vince McMahon. I don't know how much he's talking to him about the product, but I'm sure, Triple H didn't want to sit down at Thanksgiving dinner with his father-in-law and have him ask, why'd you ruin my product? Why'd you do all these things that I wouldn't have done? And I think that might be something that's being could over time slowly be weaned away, that it would be offensive to Vince McMahon, who's this man that they all greatly respect, to change the product radically within weeks of him stepping down. It would have to be a gradual, slow change where they still embrace and respect all of Vince's creative decisions while slowly implementing a little bit of change here and there to give it its own unique flavor. I think that's a real possibility for why we haven't seen major sweeping changes yet.
Well, if you want to go conspiracy, there is the dark Twitter theory that Vince is still pulling the strings to some degree from behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I think I posted that in our Discord, the Voices of Wrestling Discord, that is, not our Discord. But that just using the Gargano example as just this is what Vince would do. And that kind of part of that, everyone I talk to that is very smart and knows a lot about why Vince actually got fired or why Vince actually had to resign in relation to his NDAs and the not disclosing the NDAs, and not reporting them and things like that, that it would be incredibly stupid from a financial point of view for Vince to still be associated in the creative aspects of WWE.
To get caught lying about that.
Right. It would just be so, if they were to have their Vince Russo accidentally emailing Mike Johnson moment, that they would just be catastrophically destroyed by
a story broken by Joe Lanza, by the way.
That they would just be destroyed by the SEC, and that it would just be a horrible look for the company to still be doing that.
Yeah.
There's a reason Vince resigned very quickly and without much fanfare, and without fighting it. But at the same time, you look at the lack of changes in the product between Triple H and Vince McMahon's eras, and you could see some of the Vinceisms creeping into the product and still around. It's not hard to see why people would speculate that.
Yeah, Vince's fingerprints are all over the product. And I'm not pushing forward this conspiracy theory, but uh, they're everywhere. And it could be that that's just, people like Bruce Pritchard who still have a heavy hand in creative, just old habits dying hard and just doing what they know and what he's been doing for decades.
Well, yeah, I mean, Bruce Pritchard, who sometimes gets credited as being this guy, oh, he's been around the world in pro wrestling and he's, worked under all these different guys. So he's got this wealth of knowledge, which is probably true to an extent. Certainly he comes from a very, diverse background of working with people. But at the end of the day, Bruce Pritchard's goal and his claim to fame in pro wrestling has been an understanding of what booking for Vince and understanding what Vince wants. That's what he
Correct.
knows about booking pro wrestling. And if he's still making a lot of creative decisions in WWE, which we're led to believe that he is because his backstage role hasn't changed since Triple H took over, it's reasonable to believe that this is what he knows is booking for Vince, and whether or not Vince is there or not, he's going to book like he is, because that is what Bruce Pritchard knows as a creative person in pro wrestling. And that's why it gives off the impression that Vince's fingerprints are still all over the product. My last theory is what I touched on before, that what if this is what Triple H's version of wrestling is? What if what we are seeing is Triple H's idealized version of wrestling, and it really ultimately isn't that much different from Vince's version? At the end of the day, Triple H is a guy who has been working underneath Vince McMahon since he was in his mid-20s. And I'm not so sure that Triple H is this guy who really believes that pro wrestling is radically different than what Vince McMahon believed, because he's been learning under the tree of Vince McMahon for pretty much his entire professional career. And it's hard for me to fully believe that Triple H is ultimately that much different than Vince McMahon when it comes to what he thinks of pro wrestling can and should be, when it comes to what WWE's product should look like.
Yeah, I mean, time will tell. Um, obviously NXT looked drastically different, but he may have felt that it had to in order to be the kind of success he wanted it to be, because doing the exact same product that the main roster was doing, it wouldn't have stood out. Maybe there was just some ego there in that he's running this subdivision of the company, which wasn't expected to make money, didn't need to make money, often lost money. So when you don't have the pressures of being a real booker who has to survive by making money, Court Bauer and Billy Corgan have to make money or they cease to exist, right? Like, Tony Khan is a billionaire, so he has less pressure from that standpoint. But if he's running AEW as a separate business that has books and is expected to turn a profit to stay alive in order to remain a billionaire, then he too has more pressure than Triple H ever had in NXT to book a pro wrestling product that actually finishes in the black. Triple H didn't have that pressure in NXT. So, he didn't have to make money there and often didn't. So maybe he was just popping himself or filling up basketball stadiums with takeovers to pop his own ego. Whereas now he understands he has to answer to investors, and he cannot. He's not booking an alternate to something. He's booking the thing. So maybe what he's presenting goes against what he would like to see, his sensibilities, his tastes, but what he ultimately feels will be the most successful for the largest mainstream audience. And that's the thing that was working before that had earned billion-dollar media rights deals. Whereas when he was booking NXT, he didn't have to worry about that because he didn't have to worry about making money at all. It was all perception.
Yeah, it's just for exercise purposes. Let's just imagine Triple H, like let's just imagine NXT and Triple H's run booking NXT. Let's just imagine that didn't exist. What about Triple H's career and his personality that you knew? What about that would make you think that Triple H would like, if he was booking a wrestling product, he would want to push small indie wrestlers who were really good workers that did all a bunch of high flying moves?
Right. There's nothing in his background that suggests that that's the way he would. Right.
Right. That's not how he worked as a wrestler. It's not how necessarily how talent that he respected as a wrestler worked. He's always been, kind of like a big, you know, I'm a big guy and you wrestle this way and you do your Harley race tributes and all this stuff like that. He's not. I never really fully have bought into the idea that Triple H like strongly embraces like independent wrestling or even other types of pro wrestling the way that I feel like Tony Khan, to use another example, has embraced. Like I feel like Tony Khan really loves lucha libre. And so when you turn on AEW, you can see occasionally some lucha libre influences in the product. I think he really loves, certain versions of Japanese pro wrestling. I think he loves um, old territory style wrestling in certain ways. Like I get the sense that he really loves these things and that he thinks that his product should have those influences. For Triple H, I always felt like he was trying to, present an alternative product and stand out as one of the cool kids. But deep down, I've never been really convinced that he thinks that like Johnny Gargano should be a main event star. And I think that's being reflected in how Gargano has been booked on the main
I
roster.
think his vision in pro wrestling might be melodrama. A lot of his
Yep.
programs as a wrestler revolved around that. Um, Obviously, and the core of the main event NXT booking when they were at their hottest was all about that. With Gargano and Adam Cole and Tommaso Ciampa and
Why am I so violent?
all, yeah. Um, and we're seeing that with the Bloodline feud, the Bloodline storyline, tons of melodrama and um, long backstage segments with terrible community theater level acting, and that might be his core belief, his core um, sort of style that he believes in, because that's kind of been a constant in his career with booking NXT and now with what we've seen on the main roster. There's a lot of that. And obviously he's endorsing what Shawn Michaels is doing in NXT, which is turning that stuff up to 10. So, and he's obviously very tight with Shawn Michaels, and Shawn Michaels incorporated a lot of that to his wrestling, and he learned a lot from Shawn Michaels. So I think that might be the answer you're looking for. The answer to the question of what's Triple H's vision of wrestling. It might be these melodramatic storytelling elements, and everything else is secondary.
Right.
And if that's the case, that'll never be for me. So but the core fan base, you hear them talk, and through indoctrination, decades of indoctrination of Vince McMahon telling them this and telling his talent this, and then talent filtering that down from hearing it from Vince, and people like Eric Bischoff pushing it in the media. Storytelling. Where's the story? So their core fan base buys into that stuff, which again begs the question, is that really what Triple H believes in? Or is it what he knows the core fan base believes in? Maybe we'll never know. See, I don't know if we're getting Tony Khan's idealized version of wrestling every Wednesday on Dynamite. We're getting elements of it for sure, but I'm sure there'd be a lot of things different about AEW if Tony Khan was just booking for himself. I can name a few, but I don't want to get your show canceled. Okay. So maybe that's the same thing that goes on with Triple H, where maybe we'll never know what, if he were to sit down on the couch and put his feet up and pop on the network, Maybe we'll never know what he would choose to watch first, whether it would be Mid South or ECW or 1987 WWF or Mid Atlantic or the Attitude Era. Maybe we'll never know. And maybe he's just being pragmatic about, to use one of his favorite terms, what's best for business.
Right. And I think any person that's in any business has to operate at least with that in the back of their mind, right? Which is, I don't think anyone, for the most part, in any business is running their business in this idea of, I'm going to provide exactly what I and only I want. Everyone is always looking at what is the best way for me to actually generate revenue with my business.
Unless you feel like there's millions of people like you. I
right.
mean, so, or unless you feel that your vision can fill a certain niche. But see, they're not in the niche business. They're the market leader. So maybe we'll never know the answer to your theory number 3. I don't know. I mean, because, as we've talked about for 2 hours here, it sure looks a lot like the other guy's vision.
Right. And so lastly, we'll wrap it up by saying, what do you expect from Triple H over the next 100 days? Now, the next 100 days will take us up right about a few weeks before WrestleMania. So we'll get through the Royal Rumble and we'll get through the I think it's the Elimination Chamber still. But we're going to be leading up to WrestleMania. I think there is a lot of speculation, more speculation than I think in recent years about the Royal Rumble and who's going to actually win the Royal Rumble and who's going to face Roman Reigns at WrestleMania. I feel like we've seen a lot of speculation based on that over the last, few months at least. Than in other and then in years past where I think people kind of only start taking the Rumble that seriously in the few days leading up to it. But I don't know. We're 100 and, like I said, 127 days into his reign so far. Do you have any specific things you think things are going to look a lot different 100 days from now, or do you think things are going to be about the same as far as what we see from Triple H's product? Do you think we'll finally start seeing some more significant changes as we get closer to WrestleMania and as we see kind of what his major plans are for their biggest show of the year? Or do you think we'll continue to kind of see basically a clone of the Vince product with slight differences here and there?
No, as people could probably guess listening to this show, I don't see any sweeping changes coming until at least the new television deal kicks in. And then we'll see. I'll remain open-minded at that point. But I just think being conservative here is the play. It's working. You don't want to upset the apple cart right now. I feel like that's the mindset. And then when they get their new TV deal, then we go from there. I think it's going to be much of the same. It will be his first WrestleMania. That falls out of the 100 days that you're talking about here. So we'll see what his first WrestleMania looks like. Again, I think it's going to look a lot like Vince's 2-night WrestleManias. And then, shortly after that, once we hit SummerSlam, we'll have a full year under our belt. And, I don't look, the same people we look, to summarize, the same people are in place. The shows are nearly identical. All the booking rhythms are the same. So to answer your question, no, I don't expect any changes in the next 100 days. I expect much of the same.
And I think one thing that we haven't touched on yet, but I think is good to keep in mind, and part of it goes back to him bringing in all these other talent, signing all these talents that weren't doing anything else. But when he took over the book, partially due to Vince McMahon bleeding the roster with budget cuts and things like that, the cupboard wasn't really full for him when it comes to looking at his roster and say, man, I got to push some new guys. Who am I going to push? Even now, you look at that roster, they don't have a ton of young, exciting talent that maybe was being overlooked by Vince and that Triple H could rehabilitate and push them really hard. You look at the roster even now, and it's like, okay, who are some young guys that aren't getting any run right now? Who would I push really hard coming up? The WWE roster is just not that deep. The bench isn't that deep. They don't have that many people that I feel like I would be confident in, kicking the tires on and giving a big push. If I look at like the AEW roster, and I feel like I see a lot of guys that I feel like could be doing a lot more and have the potential to eventually be stars. I don't see that with the WWE roster, and that's going to take a lot of time for Triple H to kind of restock. He's kind of like a baseball team that just sold off everything, and now they're trying to restock their farm system, and it's going to take years for them to develop their own prospects and maybe make a few free agent moves to kind of round out this roster with talent, because I just don't think he has the raw talent at this point in time to potentially make radical changes that some fans would want to see.
Completely agree. Completely
And I,
agree. I
I
think
think that's
it's
overlooked. I think people just assume because they're WWE, they have this super loaded roster full of guys, and they really don't.
they don't. I mean, that is one huge advantage I think AEW has on WWE right now is they have a very very clear next tier. They have guys on the bench ready for the push, and it's wrestling, so you never know if the push is going to take. But they have pieces on the bench that they can flip the switch on at any time, and that they're starting to flip the switch on. We'll see Ricky Starks get his first world title match in a couple of weeks against MJF. Powerhouse Hobbs is percolating underneath. Jungle Boy is transitioning to Jack Perry. We can go on and on. Okay.
WWE would kill, I think, and maybe they wouldn't because they're dumb, but if I was WWE, I would kill to have someone like Daniel Garcia on the roster right now.
Garcia, listen, MJF on those early Bleacher Report shows before Dynamite existed was working opening match 6-man tags. I mean, they've already in 3 years successfully elevated someone.
Joe, I've been told by plenty of people though that they have not created any new stars.
Yeah, well, I mean, go look where MJF was booked on those Bleacher Report shows. Throw away 6-man tags with no stories. So already in their 3 years, they've elevated someone from the opening match into one of the hottest stars in the entire wrestling business. Okay. And then, there's other examples too. And who's on WWE's bench? Who's the obvious person to take down Roman Reigns? It's no disrespect to Sami Zayn, but a banged up veteran who's been doing this for over 20 years, whose body is destroyed, who has found second life as a very entertaining comedy figure, is your leading contender right now. And Cody Rhodes, who's 35 years old and, isn't exactly at the hot prospect stage of his career. No disrespect to either one of those guys. But who's on their bench? Braun Breaker? Okay. We'll see. Hasn't had 100 matches yet in his life. Who else? Madcap Moss? You might laugh, but he might be next in line. Who else is there? Dominic doesn't have that kind of upside. I mean, someone give me the names. So that is one huge advantage AEW has. And that's one thing that Tony Khan absolutely does not get enough credit for. He has slowly been building these people up. Ricky Starks came from off the street. Tryout match, live on TV in front of no fans. You go right down the line. Jungle Boy, West Coast indie guy.
Even guys that have, barely wet their feet, people like, Lee Moriarty and the top flight guys, and guys that are really young.
The seeds are being planted with tons of people in that
Nick
company.
Wayne.
Right.
Like
already signed to a preemptive contract. And, WWE has a full-on developmental system. They don't have any prospects down there.
And they've had it for 10 years.
They don't have any prospects down there. Carmelo Hayes, he's 5'6". He has a better shot now than he would have under Vince. But I mean, who they got?
Yeah, I mean, if I were to say, like, what is Triple H's, what should be his number one goal over the next 2 or 3 years? And I would say it has to be identifying the person who's going to take the mantle from Roman Reigns as the face of the company. And it just really doesn't appear like there was someone who is an obvious choice to do that. maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe you don't need someone to take the mantle from Roman Reigns. You can, he can go and be a part-time guy. He basically already is, but he could become an even more part-time guy, and you could pass the title around a few established people, but you don't need to have that de facto top, super top guy. You could pass it around through different people. But I think that's something that needs to be addressed, which is like, who are we going to find and promote as our next top guy? I have a lot of issues and qualms with the entire Roman Reigns push from the moment he debuted on the main roster. But at the end of the day, Roman Reigns was someone that WWE identified from a very early stage and said, this guy's going to be our new top guy. He's replacing John Cena. And they followed through with those plans. Maybe they would have been better off if they pivoted at some point. Maybe they would have been better off if they chose somebody else. But they did follow through with that and have executed that plan for the last decade plus. And in their minds and many fans' minds, that has been a major success for them. Who are they going to do with that next, and are they going to pick the right person? And it's, maybe it's they sign MJF as a free agent to a gigantic contract and he does it. I'm sure that that's always in the back of their mind too, is that there'll be free agents available that they can bring in, and that maybe they don't have to develop this next top star. Maybe they can sign them. Maybe Tony Khan will do that for them. Maybe someone else will do that for them. But I think that as far as Triple H coming in right now, he's got like I said, a bare cupboard, and it's going to take a while, especially because a lot of these guys in AEW have years left on their contracts. It's going to take a while to kind of rebuild that bench and get to a point where you have, young, exciting prospects again.
Does Austin Theory feel like he has the momentum that Hangman Page or MJF had in, 2020? I mean,
Yeah,
do any of these, they're just not
yeah,
building a bench.
it's hard because I think like the way WWE's product has been presented over the last few years, it's really hard for me to believe in the way that, because the way talent is forced, the way they're forced to talk and the way that they're forced to try to get over is so counterproductive to getting
Hey,
over.
hey, you know what though? You can change that.
Right, but it's hard for me to evaluate that at this point. Like, Theory to me now, and also with the Reigns push, is WWE has shown that they'll just push someone as hard as possible, and they don't care if the crowd rejects them. They'll just keep pushing them, and they'll have them win a bunch of matches, and they'll have them be the world champion forever. And by sheer attrition, they will eventually come across like a big star, which Reigns has
Yeah.
finally achieved years and years later since his push began. And there's nothing stopping them from doing that with Theory or Braun Breaker, even if they don't have the charisma or the connection with the audience to really cut it, that they have shown that they will just go full steam right ahead. I wish they'd choose a different way, but
And with the benefit of fixed media rights deals that total in the billions, you have the luxury to do that.
right. And you'll always have 2 million sycophant fans who will watch and say it's great anyway.
Which, and I know this is off the beaten path, but that's one of my primary arguments against Roman Reigns for the Observer Hall of Fame. If he had failed to get over for 7 years at any other time in history in any other company, that would have been it for him. But the company
But
he was in had the luxury of continuing to move forward with him, even as he failed, until it finally, eventually, maybe worked, which we think it might be working now, but who knows?
but
He would have never had
Paul
that
Heyman
luxury.
but Paul Heyman in a Jonathan Snowden article told me that Roman Reigns drew $1 billion. He's the
Well,
greatest wrestler of all time. Who else could say that?
I'm sure Snowden pushed back. Um, so you're right. They could do that with the next guy because they have that luxury. Where, and we kind of touched on this earlier, Tony Khan or, whoever else you want to name, Gato, Billy Corgan, they don't have the luxury of just force feeding somebody. And if it's not working, it doesn't matter. The shit that they do has to work. So you're right. Maybe they can just pick Braun Breaker or Austin Theory or Madcap Moss or whoever, Dominic, whoever the fuck, and just decide they're the top guy now. And, eventually, like you say, through sheer force and attrition, their fan base will just eventually just buy it. Because they also have the advantage of a fan base which wants to buy into what they're selling now.
Right.
A few years ago, they didn't have that. They had a
Yeah,
fan base that was openly rejecting what they were selling.
right.
But
And
those
they
fans are
weeded,
gone.
yeah, they weeded those fans out,
The
and that
fans that are
helps.
left want to like what the company's giving them. And that
Right.
is a huge advantage to have. And that's not even a knock, because there's people who use that as a knock against AEW. Oh, their fans are hot for everything. Well, good. You want to cultivate the fan base that likes your product.
Right. We're kind of getting out away from this, but a few years ago, it was normalized so much by WWE's audience reactions for the crowd to dislike the wrestling company.
Yeah.
This is why Paige never got to fail. Paige's promos were, or Soraya's promos were so bad in AEW when she first came up, because she was cutting WWE 2015 promos where you come out and say everything sucks and I'm going to change things.
Correct.
Normal people watching who are fans who paid a ticket to watch a wrestling show like the product. So the person that's saying everything sucks and I'm going to change things is a heel. But
Right.
that was something that was just a common sentiment that people expected in WWE. That's not really the case anymore, and that helps. I still think the fans. I still think the fans have a little bit more fight in them. It just takes them more to be provoked, and you'll see that from time to time, uh, with how certain things are handled. That like the like I would have said the same thing a year ago, right? That the fans don't get mad anymore and they just love whatever WWE shovels at them. But then something like the dropping out Big E happened, and all these people were like, "Oh my god, I can't believe it! It's so terrible!" And I was like, "Really? I thought you guys would just like anything." But there are certain things that will still trigger that fan base, even if they're still come back and keep watching.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's going to wrap it up. I appreciate Joe being on the pod. Joe, do you have anything in particular you want to plug?
Yeah. Flagship podcast every week. I think that probably a good portion of your listeners are familiar with it, but if you're not, and you enjoyed my takes today, I give you 3 hours worth every week with Rich Craich on the Flagship podcast. We also have a Patreon with tons of bonus content, historical lookbacks, and this guy, Jesse Collings, every week on the NFL Intelligentsia, where we ramble on for far too long each week, breaking down the previous week's action in the NFL. So if you like Jesse and you want to hear him talk about football, you can find that on the Flagship Podcast Patreon. 3 price tiers: $1, $5, $10. So that's about it for my plugs.
All right. Well, again, we appreciate you coming on to the show again. We thank everyone who's been following and listening and viewing and consuming this podcast. It's been a lot of fun. And we'll see everyone again next time.